Hello YouTube, it's me again. At last I am back. I apologise for having been away for such a long time. It makes me probably a very, very bad YouTuber that I keep having these huge gaps between when I make videos and don't have much of a schedule. But I suppose I can probably just about get away with it. Please forgive me because I've been very, very busy these last few weeks. Anyway, as you can probably tell from the title that I've given to this video, this is going to be a little musing about bisexuality, something that I did promise to give you a little while ago, I think about 2 videos back. So what this is really going to be is a look at the language and the labels that are used to describe bisexuality and other forms of sexuality and how it all sort of fits together. The thing, of course, first of all to remember about all of these labels is that they're entirely created. They're social constructions that people use as a code word to define their behaviour and their identity in that way, so they're sort of fairly free and easy. You can use ones that you like, and of course meanings can change, which I think is quite an important thing about language anyway. But of course you have the point is that with a label you have to have one, something that it means something to you, and two, that it means something to someone else, which can occasionally cause problems when the two don't really gel very well together, which is a problem particularly with bisexuality. So bisexuality to begin with, what is it and how did it come to get its name? Well, it's quite interesting really in that various forms of sexuality often considered deviant by modern society only really got their labels and their ideas of being sort of identifiable sexualities in historical terms very recently. It was really only a creation of the late 19th century and the early 20th century that you said that person is a homosexual person or a heterosexual person or whatever else they might be. Initially it was just the fact that, I fancy having sex with this kind of person today or that kind of person today, so it was a question of behaviour rather than being something that you were. In fact, one of the things a lot of people will point out is that in the classical world, in ancient Greece, and to a similar extent but slightly different cultural paradigm in ancient Rome, for adult men, bisexuality was in many ways a social norm. You would be expected, probably, to have both sex with women, usually for procreative purposes, but often for pleasure. There was a situation where older men would have sex with teenage boys in a kind of relationship like that, and it's quite interesting, and I probably will go on to talk about that more often, being a historian. That I think is a very interesting concept, and I'd like to go on about that later. But anyway, going back to the modern world and the labels that we have in it. Bisexuality comes from a combination, of course, sexuality, sex, that kind of thing, and the Greek word bi, meaning two. So it's two sexuality, and the opposite to bisexuality is, of course, monosexuality, mono meaning one, so one sexuality. From that, in the modern world, in this sort of very basic conception of sexuality as per the gender that it engages with, you have this chart where you have bisexuality, monosexuality, and then monosexuality will then split into homosexuality and heterosexuality. I have made a chart of this for your benefit. However, to be potentially rather cruel to you, I would like to point out that in many ways this chart is a load of rubbish. It really is. The real problem with the term bisexuality that a lot of people have, and is quite a understandable gripe about it, is that because it revolves around this thing of 2 and 1, it implies that gender is a completely binary construct. You're either a man or a woman, that's it. There's no in-between ground, and that's it, which of course is both incorrect, because as scientists have increasingly started to prove, in terms of its psychological and even biological value, gender is much more of a spectrum than just a simple binary divide. And the other thing is, of course, that the whole idea of gender roles are socially constructed rather than having like a firm fundamental basis in nature and reality. And of course, saying that gender is a binary construct in that way is very, very marginalising to the people who don't really fit very easily into one of those two categories, particularly transgender individuals and intersexual individuals. And the point about bisexuality is basically if you say that, well, the argument is, if you say that you're bisexual, and that way you have two sexualities, so you only like people who are definitely men or women, and that might be the case for some people, but I still think it's a rather marginalising thing, and of course there are probably quite a lot of people out there, me included, who wouldn't sort of rule out having a relationship with someone who didn't fit into one of those two categories very easily. although at the moment I would point out that I am in a monogamous relationship with someone else at the moment, so I'm not really free to explore in that context. Anyway, for this reason particularly, I prefer to use the term queer just to describe myself. The problem, of course, with that is that it's a very vague, broad term that you then have to really expand on to people who don't just immediately think, oh, okay, that's fine, I'll accept that. And of course there is also a linguistic divide, whereas in the wider sort of LGBTQ community worldwide, it usually is just something that you use to define membership of that community on a personal level, whereas of course in certain areas, particularly as like the US that I've found, it is very much means that you are a gay man, which isn't quite what I am. Anyway, so I would use the term bisexual really to describe what I am because it's the nearest sort of cultural code word that can be found to describe my sexuality, as it were, even if it's not a very good term because it has this controversial element to it. The other term that occasionally comes into this debate is the term pansexual, which a lot of people will identify as and a lot of people will use. Pansexual, of course, in its linguistic roots comes from the Greek word pan, meaning all, so it's all sexual, which while it has less of an element of being slightly controversial in terms of marginalising anyone, I still think it's slightly confusing in terms of its linguistic accuracy, which is always a difficult thing to find. Because on the one hand, it could imply that you're sexual with every single person, but also, of course, given that human sexuality is such a huge, broad spectrum that includes an innumerate number of things, it could involve things like I am everything, I am all sexual, so like even going outside the realms of human sexuality, saying, oh, I also like animals and inanimate objects, which I don't really, so I wouldn't use that term anyway. The other thing about pansexuality that a lot of people who identify it as talk about are things like being gender blind, so they tend to sexually connect with people on a level that doesn't really include gender as a prerequisite, whereas even as someone who is happy to go with, I say all genders is potentially, because that would also includes not just sort of cisgender men and women, but also those who don't fall into that category. But the idea of being blind to gender is something I don't really quite feel. I don't really quite understand. I think at a sort of level of first-hand experience, because for me it's a case of, oh, that woman is or that man is really nice, and sort of beyond that. So I take gender into account in terms of my sexuality, but it doesn't matter to me like, I suppose it would to a straight person, in the way that you have woman, good, or man, bad, kind of thing like that, or anything like that. It's quite hard to explain. I'm probably not doing it very well. But anyway, I don't really identify as a pansexual also because, of course, as anyone who has seen a lot of the other videos that I've done, that I have other weird sexual parameters and issues that I tend to have, so that means that I tend to focus on one other group within the sort of gender milieu that I have of that kind of thing. So it all gets very confusing, and I prefer the term bisexual in terms of that regard, because I don't then have to deal with all the element of pansexuality, which I don't think I really feel anyway. As I said at the beginning, an important thing to remember about all of this is that all of these labels are entirely created and they mean different things to different people, and in the end they're not really very important. Every individual out there is essentially unique, and so you don't always really fit into one box very easily and all of that. I'm making rather ridiculous metaphors at this stage, but the point is, this is one of the things I just want to say about bisexuality. This is why I use that label for myself occasionally, though I prefer to use another one if there was one that was more accurate, although of course probably the best thing to do is just to be me and say, up yours to the world, because it doesn't really matter. I am me, and you can't really define what I am except by giving a complete description of everything that I do, which is of course where the idea of labels comes in. It's basically a shorthand way of saying, this is what I like, this is what I do, basically deal with it, that kind of way of thinking. I apologise this one was a bit all over the place, I think, in comparison to some of the other ones that I've done, though I think I'm not very good at keeping my videos on track in any case. So thank you for watching. This one's quite a lot shorter than a lot of the other ones, so it might be more manageable, but anyway, thank you for watching and goodbye. I shall see you again soon.